Good morning to you. Let's start today by talking about what is serious and what isn't serious. The soap opera. Boris loves Dom, Dom loves Boris, Boris hates Dom, Dom hates Boris. All right, so what? It's headline candy, it's clickbait. But the detailed allegations Dominic Cummings has made about this government, even if half true, and I should say the government says they aren't, are very serious. Let's just remind ourselves, the Prime Minister's plans for paying for a plusher Downing Street flat are, says Mr Cummings, unethical, foolish and possibly illegal. He claims the Prime Minister has fallen below the standards of integrity and competence the country deserves. He's said to be planning an attack in front of MPs on the slow lockdown moves many think caused the death of tens of thousands of people. And so, yes, a Westminster soap opera, and yes, deadly serious. This morning, I'll be talking to one of Mr Johnson's most popular cabinet ministers, the Trade Secretary, Liz Truss, and to the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner. But these are serious times, and there is so much else to talk about. I've been speaking to Boris Johnson's climate change czar, the former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, and as Scots observe all of this in the middle of an election which might eventually affect the unity of the UK, I'm talking to Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and to the new Scottish Labour leader, Anna Sarwar. If after all of that you're thinking of going out and throwing yourself into the nearest lake, don't, please. Life is beautiful. I know because I've been speaking as well to Britain's most celebrated and loved artist, David Hockney, about his new work on the arrival of spring in France. Reviewing the news, Caroline Wheeler, the deputy political editor of the Sunday Times, and our very own political correspondent, Leila Nathoo. But first, the news headlines from Chris Mason.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning. India has recorded a global record of new coronavirus cases for the fourth day running, with 349,000 infections reported in the last 24 hours. Hospitals say their patients are dying because of a shortage of oxygen. Labour is calling for a senior minister to face MPs' questions over allegations the Prime Minister considered asking Conservative donors to help fund the refurbishment of his Downing Street flat. Boris Johnson's former adviser, Dominic Cummings, claims the plans to fund the work were what he called possibly illegal. English football's governing bodies have agreed on a social media boycott in response to the ongoing abuse suffered by many connected to the sport. Premier League, English Football League and Women's Super League clubs will stop using Twitter, Facebook and Instagram in an effort to combat discrimination online. And it's the biggest event in the Hollywood calendar tonight, but this year's Oscars promises to be a more understated affair. While nominees are allowed to attend in person, strict social distancing rules will be in place. That's all from me. The next news here on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Many thanks, Chris. And as you may have gathered from the top of the show, there is one story in town this morning, for most papers, not all of them, but almost all of them. The Sunday Mirror, Boris in phone security blunder. The Mail on Sunday, Number 10 rages at nasty sexist Cummings. The Observer, Johnson faces MP's fury over Downing Street sleaze claims. The Sunday Express has gone in a different direction. It's talking about the return of normal life as a result of the successful vaccination programme. That story is also on the front page in a different way of the Sunday Telegraph. But Number 10 fears Cummings' bombshell dossier, it says. And finally, the Sunday Times, Cummings to blame the Prime Minister for the COVID death toll. And they've also got a heartbreaking report from India, which we'll talk about as well. Now, to review the papers, let's start with Leila. You've got a wonderful sort of cartoon there from the Mail on Sunday. They're channeling the Beezer or Topo or possibly the Beano with all the characters. If you can't be bothered to read, there are the pictures.
Yeah, fantastic illustrations in the Mail, what it calls a psychodrama in Downing Street, the spectacular, very public falling out between Boris Johnson and his former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings. Boris Johnson earlier this week accusing Dominic Cummings of being behind leaks of damaging stories coming out of Downing Street. Dominic Cummings hitting back, denying those, but actually more importantly, making a string of very serious allegations coming from somebody, yes, there might be questions about his own credibility, but coming from somebody who was at the very heart of government, talking about potentially unethical, illegal, incompetent behaviour by the Prime Minister, bringing this right back to the Prime Minister.
He says he's got WhatsApps and other messages, he's got some documentary evidence for all
Absolutely, and I think that, a lot of the papers talk about that potential unease inside government about what more could still be to come. It's definitely not the end of the story as far as Dominic Cummings is concerned. He talked about being prepared to give up his WhatsApps and emails, giving evidence in front of MPs next month in what promises to be a big select committee hearing.
Leila, in all of this, a lot of people will be wondering, yes, but what does it matter to me? In terms of trying to sort of sift through all the different allegations and pick out what might matter most to people watching, what would you say?
I think it brings it home to questions about Boris Johnson. We've been talking a lot about lobbying and influence and access in Westminster in recent weeks. This brings it back to questions about Boris Johnson's own judgment, his own competence, how he is going about the business of government in Downing Street. It also, lays bare the sort of climate inside Downing Street again. Is this chaos, distraction, personal vendettas actually distracting Boris Johnson from getting on with the business of government? Yeah. And what more could be to come in the coming weeks?
Caroline Wheeler, you've written a huge amount of very interesting stuff on this on the Sunday Times today. But can I ask you a bit of a reality check? Obviously, Number 10 denies a lot of this. Boris Johnson has kind of exiled, defenestrated, otherwise stamped on all internal Tory opposition to him at a senior level. He's way ahead in the polls and he's got a big parliamentary majority. This is not really a threat to him, is it?
Well, there has been some speculation today that there are people waiting in the wings to start a sort of leadership contest if this really does sort of explode and overtake the government. But I think that talk of leadership contests is very premature at this stage. I mean, really, you're absolutely right. He doesn't have any particular opposition. There are some challenges ahead for the government, particularly with those elections coming in 10 days' time, which will be the first test for Boris's government. It's the first elections that he's faced since that general election victory and since the pandemic. But I think suggestions that this in any way is going to engulf his leadership at this point is unrealistic.
Yeah. You've chosen the possibility or likelihood, perhaps, of Dominic Cummings going to the House of Commons committee and talking about the slow lockdown decisions as being at the heart of this. Because if we're talking about things that will cut through, that's the big one. Again, talk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we understood at the time, just when we were thinking about COVID with that second lockdown looming in September. And if you remember, there was a lockdown that nearly happened, talk about the circuit breaker at the half term that never occurred. And then we locked down much later. And we know at that time that Dominic Cummings was extremely vocal in his views that the government should lock down again and lock down much quicker than it eventually did. And there are definitely concerns both within Downing Street that this is really where Dominic Cummings is going to aim his fire when he speaks to MPs on that select committee on May the 26th. And really what they're concerned about is that he took an awful number of documents and he has emails and WhatsApps. And they're concerned that there might be information in there that suggests that the Prime Minister was perhaps more reckless in his views towards the death toll and didn't really think about that in the context that he should have done when he was thinking about the damage that was going to be done to the economy. So the concern is there that he will use that to damage Boris Johnson and to attack him and to suggest that he was responsible for those excess death numbers that occurred in the autumn.
Meanwhile, Leila, Number 10 have been hitting back quite hard overnight and all day about Dominic Cummings' credibility, as you mentioned earlier on. This is really about different tribes going to war at the heart of government, isn't it? There's a very interesting big spread there by Caroline and others, bringing in also, of course, Carrie Simons, the Prime Minister's other half, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. She's also a sort of big player in this story. Remember when Dominic Cummings left Downing Street towards the end of last year, it was to do with a kind of power struggle inside Number 10 in which he lost. And I think we're finding out just how acrimonious now that parting was. But, you can see that this presents a bit of a gift for Labour.
It's a bit glorious for the Labour Party,
It is, because
Yes.
all week they have been trying to draw Boris Johnson into this row about lobbying, access, influence, and trying to sort of point it at Boris Johnson's door. We had those text messages that came out between Boris Johnson and the Business Minister James Dyson, Labour talking about sleaze, what they call as Tory sleaze. And I think they see this as a bit of a victory, that they can now keep going with their suggestions that they're going to go for an urgent question in the Commons tomorrow in Parliament to try and get a minister to answer some of these questions. Interestingly, also in the Herald this morning, Nicola Sturgeon also weighing in, talking about sleaze.
The Glasgow Herald,
well.
yes. Well, the Herald in Glasgow, I should call it. Let's talk a little bit about some other stories. Opening up is a very big story. The Sunday Telegraph has a letter from a lot of scientists and others saying, really, the government has to be absolutely clear that all the restrictions are going to go in June. We're doing so well when it comes to deaths and hospitalisations and the vaccine rollout. It is now time to declare, once and for all, it's freedom in June.
Absolutely. There's been a reluctance in government to be definitive about what could possibly happen in these next stages of lockdown. But clearly, with the sort of success of the vaccination programme, the coverage that is going up and up by the day, there are now more and more discussions about whether there should be any residual restrictions at the end of June. Lots of people talking about social distancing, whether that should even be a factor at all. There is a review, remember, going on into that at the moment, but the government so far has been very reluctant to commit to anything definitive. And also some discussion in the Telegraph today about whether face masks in schools should continue to be used after May. Some people very concerned about that.
I'm going to be talking to Anna Sarwar and Nicola Sturgeon a bit later on, but Scotland have got slightly different rules on the opening up, and they are still going slightly slower in some respects.
They are, but tomorrow marks a bit of a bigger reopening for Scotland. We've got retail, hospitality opening up tomorrow. 2 households can meet in public settings too. So tomorrow is the next step for Scotland on their way out of lockdown.
Caroline, let's talk about Australia, because there's a big trade deal coming from Liz Truss, which has been covered in a lot of the papers. And this will be very, very good news for Australian farmers. We're still unclear how good the news is for British farmers.
Yes, that's right. This interview with Liz Truss in the Telegraph is interesting because what she's really talking about is the fact that this is the first time that we've had a trade deal agreed since we sort of left the European Union, and it's been happened quite quickly, according to her. And she's talking about the kind of benefits that we might have, including cheaper wine, for example. But of course, we don't know how that's going to turn out in terms of competition in our own markets. And there's likely to be some pushback on that. But we're going to see more and more of this because there's talk now about us joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the really big trading area with £9 trillion. And obviously, this is all part of Boris Johnson's plan for global Britain post-Brexit in terms of those trade deals that we need to do to replace the trade that we have lost with the European Union.
Leila, let's turn to one other terrible story today, which is the impact of the pandemic in India. We've seen awful scenes, and the Times has quite a headline: Modi leads India out of lockdown and into viral apocalypse.
Absolutely devastating, I think, what we're seeing in India. The footage of mass cremations, 2 to a bed in hospitals, people queuing desperately outside hospitals for oxygen. I think, people will see this as a warning against complacency, because remember, in recent weeks and months, India has somewhat declared victory over the pandemic, a warning against...
It's almost the opposite of what we were talking about a few moments ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there is a sense that India thought that it had beaten the pandemic, but the Times has some figures here saying 2 months ago, infections daily were at 11,000. Now they're at 340,000.
And some thought they might go to 500,000 a day.
Absolutely. So this rapid escalation of the worsening of the situation there, a warning against that. I think, a reminder why the government here, the priority was about protecting the NHS, because clearly the health system there has been overwhelmed. And I think it also speaks to the inequality now between different countries. So the situation in India, we're seeing that play out elsewhere, while we here are talking about reopening. The debate about vaccine inequality and donations to poorer countries, I think, will be ongoing for some time.
Absolutely. Leila, Caroline, both thank you very much indeed for that. Very interesting. And so to the weather. For many people, it's been a rather weird combination this week of bitter wind and very hot sun. If the weather was a pudding, it would be baked Alaska, and I'd rather like some more helpings of it. Over to Ben Rich in the weather studio. Ben.
I really don't know how to follow that, Andrew, to be honest, but I'll tell you that for the rest of today, it's going to be more of that sunshine. Not feeling particularly warm. I suppose that's the Alaska part of your pudding. It is going to feel quite cool for some of us today, particularly across England and Wales with this easterly wind blowing and also introducing a bit more cloud into eastern England. Some of that getting across the Midlands into East Wales, although tending to break up, so there'll still be some sunny spells. 1 or 2 showers possibly over the mountains of Scotland and quite windy down towards the south of the UK as well. The lowest temperatures will be close to the east coast at 9, 10 or 11 degrees. Further west, well, values up to 16 or 17 in places. Now, through this evening and tonight, it is going to turn chilly, just as it has over recent nights, particularly where we keep clear skies across parts of northern England, Northern Ireland, southern Scotland. We'll see more cloud filtering in further south and further north. So your overnight lows getting close to freezing, below freezing in a few places. Now, one thing some gardeners and farmers have been waiting for is rain. And this is partially good news for Monday because there is a frontal system pushing in from the north. That'll bring rain across Scotland, but not much of that rain is going to spread further south through the week. So still a lot of dry weather around, but generally speaking, it is going to turn a bit colder. Andrew.
Very many thanks for that. Now, Labour's been attempting, of course, to make the most of the lobbying, leaks and rebuttals of the last 2 weeks. These scandals have a habit of blowing up and then blowing away again. Will this one be any different? Labour's Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, joins me from Salford. Angela Rayner, welcome and good morning. Can I ask you, Labour's talked a lot about general accusations of sleaze and so for Tory sleaze. What are your specific forensic accusations about the Prime Minister himself? What do you think, in specific terms, he's done wrong?
Well, people who have his private WhatsApp, James Dyson has been able to get that contact around how he can avoid tax for people. And I think that's a very serious issue. I think the estimated £200,000 through undeclared donations to refurb his flat is a very serious allegation as well. And the issues that we've seen through ministers, etc., over the last couple of months has really undermined the institution of government. And there is serious questions now that the Conservatives need to answer around how they've dealt with their mates who have been fast-tracked through a VIP list to get contracts. You know, you've got Liz on after me and, her advisor who were involved in a company that had millions of pounds of PPE that wasn't able to be used. These questions are serious questions that need to be asked.
Well, let's look at some of the specifics. Looking at the Downing Street flat, the Electoral Commission is looking into this. You say you want a different inquiry. Why do you need a different inquiry? If the Electoral Commission is looking into it and finds evidence of wrongdoing, surely that's enough.
The Electoral Commission should be looking into it, absolutely, and doing a full investigation, especially as you've got a former senior advisor to the Prime Minister suggesting that not only was it unethical, but he believes it could be illegal as well. These are serious allegations, and we also think the Prime Minister should come to the House of Commons on Monday and should declare the Minister's Register of Interest, which is 8 months in delay. We've not seen that. Why are they hiding the fact that ministers have to declare these donations and they've not done that? That's serious. And the list of the VIPs who got contracts, who seem to be mates of Tories or Tory donors. This is a real stench around what government is about.
Yeah, okay.
And when you've got 3 million unemployed, Andrew, who has not had any support whatsoever through this COVID crisis, it really stinks.
You say stench and stinks. What I'm trying to find out is specifically what you think the Prime Minister has done wrong in clear terms and what you want done about it. Do you want a judge-led inquiry, for instance?
We want the Election Commission to look at the Prime Minister's undisclosed donations that are estimated around 200,000 for his private flat. And that's absolutely right. And the Prime Minister needs to answer that. We also want the list of VIP contracts to be published so we know which donors and friends have been given contracts. Like I say, you've got Liz Truss on after this, and her advisor was involved in a company that delivered PPE, Andrew, that could not be used, millions of pounds of PPE that could not be used. How was that happening? And we need a full investigation into that.
Let me ask you about the Dyson affair, which you mentioned earlier on. In the end, the Prime Minister says he was in the middle of a real crisis where Britain was running out of ventilators. And everybody on programmes like this, and the Labour Party, everybody was saying we need more ventilators, need more ventilators. Surely it was right for him to do anything he could to get more ventilators built into this country. And if Dyson's problem was that his people were going to be double taxed to come here and do that, that was a perfectly reasonable thing to raise with the Prime Minister. Jill Rutter, who's from the Institute of Government and not a kind of full-hearted supporter of the government generally, says it's perfectly legitimate for a business to point out a fiscal barrier to their participation in a scheme to the Prime Minister, and it's perfectly OK for the Prime Minister to raise with the Chancellor and get him to look at it. People don't really see much there that is a stench.
It should be disclosed, Andrew. That's the point. There was many companies in the UK that wanted to help the effort that didn't have the Prime Minister's WhatsApp, so didn't have that avenue in.
Yep.
And it was about making sure that there was a process to which everybody could contribute. What happened actually was the VIP list inhibited the process because people who were not vetted were pushed up because they were mates of ministers.
Well,
so actually it didn't help the situation at all, actually.
Or of opposition MPs too. It was anyone who was connected to anyone in Parliament, in fact. It wasn't just the Conservative Party. But you also mentioned Greens.
Well, I didn't have Boris Johnson's WhatsApp, Andrew, and I couldn't get any companies locally to be able to get up that list, to be honest. So I don't think it was across Parliament. And that's why we need a full investigation and we need a full disclosure of the list of VIPs who were given it.
OK, a full investigation by who?
Well, we said we had a vote in Parliament where we put down the motion saying that we wanted disclosure. The problem is the government are hiding. They haven't even published the minister's interest, and yet that was supposed to happen twice a year. 8 months in, we had the independent advisor to minister standards leave the government last year. The government still don't have an independent advisor on ethics and standards, and it looks like the Prime Minister has got no ethics and standards himself.
Isn't the truth that you are jumping on this because nothing else that you're saying as the Labour Party is cutting through in the country at the moment? We've got a huge pandemic, 127,000 people dead. We've got lots of economic problems, lots of challenges around the world. And yet the Labour Party is something like 14 points behind in polls. Not a little bit behind, a long way behind. You're jumping on this because there is nothing else.
Well, we've been highlighting the fact that it was the Tories recently who wouldn't feed the children who needed free school meals. I've highlighted the care workers who are not even getting the real living wage. Many of them don't even get the minimum wage. The NHS staff who the government legislated to give them a pay rise and they budgeted for it and now have robbed them of that. And some of us can't help but think that that's because they've wasted all this money on giving money to their mates. I think those messages are starting to cut through now, Andrew. When I'm on the doorstep now, people are talking about it and they are angry about that. I think the most important thing I have to say about Labour is many people are starting to realise that Labour has changed. We've got new leadership and we are listening. We suffered one of our worst defeats in December 2019 and we've been very clear that we're listening to the electorate and we're out there speaking to them.
And at that time you said we've got a choice. You have to win or die, you said. It doesn't look like you're winning at the moment. It's been a long time you've been lagging in the polls. When are we going to see the turnaround in Labour's fortunes? When's it going to happen?
Well, I don't think we're dying, Andrew. That's certainly not where we are. But, you know, we suffered our worst defeat in 2019 and we had to recognise that. And I think we're back in the room and having those discussions. But when you see this level of cronyism coming from the Tories at the moment, it shows that, you know, we've got Keir Starmer as our leader now. He was the head of public prosecutions. He's got a huge amount of integrity, way more than Boris Johnson has. And there's a clear choice at these elections. We're going to put our NHS, our public services and looking after our young people first, not our mates who just happen to have our WhatsApp and a load of millions of pounds in their pocket. You
want to raise this in the House of Commons with an urgent question, get a senior minister to come in and respond to MPs on it tomorrow morning, I think. Are you going to be able to do that, do you think? Is it going to happen?
Well, they should do. They should do, not just because the Labour Party demands it, but because the public deserve it. It's taxpayers' money. At a time of a pandemic where, I'd say, 3 million self-employed were not supported, many of our businesses are worried about what they're going to be able to do over the next couple of months and what support they'll get. They demand it and they deserve it. The government have to answer to why they've given out billions of pounds of money to their cronies and their friends, and they won't even declare it through the current rules. Publish the members' interests, the ministers' interests, and publish who's on that VIP list and tell us about where you're getting this money from, Boris, to do up your flat.
All right, Angela Rayner, thanks very much indeed for coming in and talking to us this morning. Much appreciated. Now, the Trade Secretary, Liz Truss, has been listening to that with me in the studio. Liz Truss, a stench hanging over government.
Well, I completely disagree with that analysis. The fact is that the Prime Minister has been 100% focused on dealing with the COVID crisis, the vaccine rollout, which is very successful.
Not phoning newspaper editors.
We've got 50% of all adults, all people in Britain now vaccinated, and of course rebuilding the economy after COVID.
Have you seen the refurbished number 10 flat?
No, I haven't. I've never been in the number 10 flat, in fact, Andrew.
So you don't know whether it's the John Lewis nightmare has been got rid of. A lot of people, including myself, see John Lewis as rather aspirational.
Well, I think John Lewis is a brilliant shop, in fact, but I haven't seen the number 10 flat in any of its guises.
The Prime Minister gets an allowance of £30,000 from the taxpayer to refurbish his flat. Do you know how much he's spent on it?
No, I don't. But I do know that the spending has been covered by him personally.
If he spent more than £30,000, should that come from his own pocket?
It has come from his own pocket, Andrew.
And so why do you think that Dominic Johnson said that the Prime Minister had plans to have donors secretly pay for the renovation?
Well, my understanding is the costs have been covered by the Prime Minister and everything is being fully declared in line with the rules.
Did a Tory party donor lend him the money beforehand?
As I said, he is covering the costs and it's being complied with fully.
The question is, did a donor provide the money beforehand?
Andrew, I am spending my time in intense trade negotiations, getting a good deal for the United Kingdom. I'm not spending my time thinking about the Downing Street flat refurbishment. What I know,
you're speaking for the government.
What I know is the Prime Minister has personally met the costs of the flat refurbishment. And that is what people in Britain want to know. And that is what's happening.
So you can't tell me whether or not he borrowed money from a Conservative Party donor to do this?
What I can tell you is he has personally met the costs.
You can't.
And that everything will be declared as it ought to be in the proper way.
I mean, the reason I'm asking about this is there are clear tax implications about what I'm asking. If the Prime Minister has undeclared money from a Conservative Party donor, even if he's paid it back now for renovations of flat, do you agree with Dominic Cummings that this would be unethical and possibly illegal?
Well, what I agree is that the Prime Minister has met the costs, that everything will be declared in line, including for tax purposes. And that's the reassurance the British public want.
Surely you need to know the answer to the basic questions. Did he borrow the money? And how much did he spend? And those kind of things.
What I need to what I need to know, Andrew, is that it is being properly declared and the Prime Minister has personally met those costs. I'm not getting involved, as you can appreciate, as Trade Secretary, in the details of flat renovations.
We're supposed to get a register of every minister's interests, published every half year, every 6 months or so. It's very late. You heard Angela Rayner saying, publish it now. Why don't you?
I'm sure it will be published.
You could go back after this programme, literally press the send button and publish it. Why not?
As I say, I'm sure it will be published in line with the rules.
We haven't had it since July 2020. That's not in line with the rules. It should have been published by now. I'm just wondering, have you any idea why it's not been published?
No, I haven't. But what I can tell you is everybody in the government is fully focused on dealing with this appalling pandemic, making sure our vaccine rollout programme is happening, making sure we recover the economy after COVID. And as I've said, everything will be properly declared. The Prime Minister has personally met the cost of the flat. But I think we need to recognise that the Prime Minister's time is rightly focused on dealing with this pandemic. And that is exactly what the British public expect.
So what would it say about the Prime Minister's priorities if it turned out that he had been phoning newspaper editors to brief against Dominic Cummings?
Well,
this Prime Minister who's focused on all the real stuff.
I can't comment on what newspaper editors and what conversations go on. What I can tell you is all of my engagement with the Prime Minister, he is focused on the issues the country is facing and dealing with them.
Except when he isn't.
Well, he is. I mean, he works incredibly hard. It's been an incredibly challenging time. But if you look at how the UK is doing in terms of our economic recovery, in terms of our vaccine programme, we are doing well and we're not complacent. Of course we need to do more, but this is what the focus is of the Prime Minister and the other ministers across the government.
You mentioned the pandemic. 6 months ago, somebody leaked the government's plans for the November lockdown. Is the inquiry into that leak still going on?
It is, yes.
Do you know when we're going to see the answers of that?
I don't know.
Now, I can't quite believe I'm asking you. This is a surreal moment. Is it possible that the Prime Minister wanted that inquiry to be stopped because he was fearful that the outcome would offend his girlfriend?
I think this is a complete load of Westminster tittle-tattle that people simply don't care about. The fact is the inquiry is ongoing. This is being looked into, but fundamentally,
they care about the handling of the lockdown, I think, very much indeed.
Absolutely, which is why, as a government, we're focusing on making sure we come out of lockdown in the right way, making sure the public's protected, making sure that the vaccine programme is rolled out, not this stream of allegations about personnel issues.
You say stream of allegations and tittle-tattle and so forth, but this is coming from a man who was very, very close to the Prime Minister through all the crucial period, through the election and afterwards and before that. Dominic Cummings says of the Prime Minister, "It is sad to see the Prime Minister and his office fall so far below the standards of competence and integrity the country deserves." What do you say to Dominic Cummings?
What I say is that the Prime Minister is doing an excellent job. He is delivering on recovering the economy from coronavirus, dealing with this disease, rolling out the vaccine programme, and I encourage the Prime Minister to carry on with that rather than listening to these noises off that we're hearing.
The Prime Minister has said that he would publish all the texts and all the relevant messages between himself and James Dyson. He said that several times and we still haven't seen them. When are we going to see those messages?
I don't know, but I'm sure if he says they will be published, they will be published.
But you don't know. All right, let's turn to the trade deal that you've been talking about. Can you promise people watching this programme that they will not have hormone-treated beef in their shops?
I can. I can absolutely promise that we're not going to lower our excellent food standards in order to do this trade deal. But what we will do through this trade deal is make sure we get fantastic British products into Australia at a much cheaper price. So whether it's whiskey or cars, which will help drive jobs and growth across Britain. And it also gives us access to a fantastic, fast-growing part of the world, the Asia Pacific. We're expecting 66% of the world's middle classes to be there by 2030. So this is all about creating the jobs and growth for the future and hitching Britain to the fastest-growing parts of the world.
This could increase our exports to Australia by 900 million, which sounds a great deal, but it's 4.2 billion the other way. In other words, this is a great deal for Australia. It's harder to see that it's a great deal for Britain. They're doing 5 times better out of it than we are.
Well, these are simply static analysis. Of course, what we need to do is encourage more British business to export. Currently, only 1 in 10 British companies export. I want to get more of them doing that. So, it's not a fixed prediction. We can change the way we do things. But actually bringing products in from Australia at more affordable prices is great for British consumers, whether it's wine or other Australian products. So I don't accept it's a kind of zero-sum game here.
Let's talk about other Australian products and indeed standards there, because there's apparently a process known as mulesing, which involves cutting the skin off the buttocks of live sheep and docking the tails as part of the way that they are treated there. It wouldn't be allowed in Britain. Have you persuaded the Australians to stop that practice before they export us their mutton?
Well, Australia do have good animal welfare practices, as we do in the United Kingdom. And of course, I will be saying more about that when we come to announcing the agreement in principle.
Well, mulesing is allowed in Australia. It's not allowed in Britain. Tail docking and the way they do it is not allowed in Britain. And British sheep farmers will be looking at this and thinking, this is simply unfair to us and not good for animal standards.
Well, I've been very clear in all of our trade deals that our farmers, with their high animal welfare standards, we won't allow them to be undermined by unfair competition. I'm very clear about that. But there are other areas, Andrew, such as the banning of foie gras, that the Australians have already done that haven't been done yet in the United Kingdom. So, of course, we need to work with partners like Australia to improve animal welfare standards across the board. I'm
still really interested in how good this deal is for British farmers. Your own department have produced an analysis saying that for agriculture and the semi-processed food sectors are estimated to see a fall in output and employment in Britain. So why are you signing a deal that will result in fewer jobs in Britain?
Well, in terms of
And that's from your own
agriculture,
department.
in terms of agriculture and farming, there is a benefit from the deal. I accept the point about the semi-processed food sector.
So there are going to be jobs lost there.
No, they're not. Just to explain the way these economic analyses work, is they're static analysis. They are not predictions of the future.
It's the only analysis we have,
and
it
at the
comes from your
moment,
department.
but at the moment, only 1 in 5 food producers export. And what I want to do is help change the culture so we get more of our fantastic food and drink out there in the rest of the world. And the benefits of this deal are products like Scotch whisky, which currently faces a tariff. The tariffs will be removed. Products like cars, the tariffs will be removed. And there will be huge opportunities for industries like financial services, professional services. And I believe we can compete. I think it's very defeatist to say that we're not going to be able to compete.
I'm only reading
it's
back
a static analysis of the world it is now. You know, the world in 2030
of course,
will be different.
The world is always changing in bad ways as well as good ways. We've seen these awful scenes.
Pessimistic,
Just wait
Andrew.
a second. Wait, hear what I'm going to say. I'm talking about the pandemic in India, which is absolutely appalling at the moment. Is there anything the British government can do to help? I mean, there's a big shortage of oxygen, for instance. Can we help them in any practical way at all?
Well, I completely agree with you that the situation in India is terrible. And in fact, I was on the phone to my Indian counterpart last week, offering the UK's support. We are looking at what we can do in areas like oxygen. We're putting together a package to try and help the Indian government and the Indian population. It is a very, very serious situation.
Finally, going back to the story of the day, as it were, the Prime Minister's involvement, Dominic Cummings and all of that, is the government going to put up a senior minister to talk to MPs directly about this tomorrow?
Well, I'm sure if urgent question is allowed, a minister will be put up to answer that urgent question. But as I've said, I think the situation is very clear that the Prime Minister has acted in line with the rules.
Liz Truss, thanks very much for coming in and talking to us today. Now, the UK and the United States used World Earth Day last week, the Climate Change Summit, to pledge new targets for cutting carbon emissions. Later this year, those world leaders will come together in person for the Glasgow COP26. I've been speaking to Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England and now a climate advisor to both the UK and the UN. I began by asking him about the UK pledge to cut emissions by 78% by 2035 compared to 1990. Another new target that sounds great, but what happens if we don't achieve it?
Well, if we, Andrew, if we carry on warming the same rate, we're talking about further increases in sea levels, erosion on our coasts in the UK. We're talking about a further increase in extreme weather events and the impact on our property.
David Joff, who's head of carbon budgets at the Climate Change Committee, says that to get to net zero, every aspect of the way we emit at the moment needs to be tackled, and we cannot just duck those difficult conversations. At the moment, we are ducking those difficult conversations, aren't we?
Well, first thing, I agree with the point. I mean, what will happen in moving to net zero is that in every region, every country, every business in every sector will need to adjust their business models. And by definition, moving to net zero means moving out of emitting carbon. So all of that does adjust. It means the end of internal combustion engine vehicles, petrol, diesel vehicles by 2030 in the UK. There will be no new sales of those. It means a wholesale shift to the type of electricity we produce. It means much more efficient, energy efficient housing for all of us, and on. So there's some big changes without question. This is an enormous shift that is required, but with it comes a better environment, cheaper energy, and a better future for all.
Let's look at some of the specifics, if I could. Our 2050 target requires energy upgrades for 2/3 of the properties across the UK. And looking at the estimates from the UK Climate Change Committee, this means that homeowners are going to face bills of up to £8,000 each. Do you know who's going to pay for this? And do you think people are aware of it?
Well, I think the government is part of it. And look, I don't speak for the government in terms of their specific policies. Let's be absolutely clear. But I will refer to the Prime Minister's 10-point plan released back in November. Included in that, one of the 10 points was for a massive upgrade in terms of the quality of our houses and flats in the UK. 600,000 heat pumps installed by 2028 every year for much more efficient heating. There are costs that come with improving, ending the draftiness of UK homes, which is long overdue, in some cases more than a century overdue. That's going to cost money, but there's going to be support for that, and it is going to save money over time.
But lots of people watching this programme are going to be thinking, am I going to be hit with an £8,000 bill anytime soon?
I don't think they're going to be hit with an £8,000 bill anytime soon. What we are going to be hit with and I'm speaking to you from Canada, whether it's Canada, the UK, the US, is an opportunity for much more efficient economies, much more resilient economies. God knows, having lived through the COVID pandemic, we've learned the cost of not building resilience, not building sustainability in advance, and then suffering the costs of a crisis. We can't make that mistake with climate. We don't have a do-over with climate.
The UK government have said that we need to see a 20% cut in the consumption of meat and dairy by 2030. But our government also says that it wants to preserve, and I quote, people's freedom of choice, including on their diet. It surely can't be both. Do you think that meat is just simply going to have to become a lot more expensive?
Andrew, I'm fundamentally an economist, so it's a question of supply and demand. I think the cost of productions is likely to go up as the quality goes up, and it's a question of how many people continue to eat as much meat as they eat today. So I'm afraid I'm going to give you, on the one hand, on the other hand, economist answer to that.
The UK's new targets also include, for the first time, limits on international aviation. Experts say that flying is going to have to become a lot more expensive. Do you think that flying is going to become a rare luxury?
I'm not sure it's a rare luxury, but it's going to become more expensive. What is going to become more expensive? The cost of emitting greenhouse gases is going to be internalized. In other words, it's going to become part of the cost of whether it's driving a car, whether it's if you're heating a home with fossil fuels, or whether you're flying. Now, part of the question, part of the big issue, and I think the big news of this week, alongside of what countries committed to, was what the financial sector, led by the UK financial sector, committed to. I just put a number out for you, putting numbers back to me: $70 trillion of finance committed to net zero, including by the leading banks and insurance companies in the UK.
Now, you mentioned the financial industry and its contribution to all of this, but after your departure as Governor of the Bank of England, it released a review of its own investments, and it found that they were in line with a 3.5% rise in global warming, which would be catastrophic. So why are you the right person to be decarbonising the financial industry?
Well, the first thing is I catalyzed the process in order to get that out. What the Bank of England owns in its assets is representative of the market. It owns the market. The market is on that trajectory to 3.5 degrees. One of the things that I did, and I'm just one person as part of a much bigger set of reforms, but was to get that information out.
Many people in the UK and indeed across the West will wonder why they have to make sacrifices at the same time as China is producing a huge amount of carbon and investing in massive new coal-fired power stations.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The first thing is it's hugely important that all countries continue to up their ambition. This week was one meeting on the road to Glasgow, as we need to use every day all the way through to Glasgow to make this a success. First point. Second point, in terms of China, China has committed to net zero emissions by 2060, peaking emissions by 2030. President Xi also indicated at the Biden summit for the first time that China will be phasing down its use of coal. Now, of course, we're going to want to see more about that, and we're going to want to see more steps. But importantly, there is the engagement, U.S. and China, in terms of bilateral relationships, but also at the G20, and we're working as well with our Chinese counterparts on the financial side.
Now, as you may have noticed, we're talking a lot about transparency in public life in Britain right at the moment. When you were Governor of the Bank of England, did politicians have your private telephone number, and did they lobby you?
Did some former politicians? I believe some of them would have. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Lobby is, no is the short answer, in terms of, you don't get very far lobbying the Bank of England. The Bank of England is independent. It's very clear what our responsibilities are, and we take those very seriously. And I think the record speaks for itself.
Mark Carney, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Now, as Scotland prepares to go to the polls on May the 6th, I've been speaking to some of the party leaders hoping to stand in the way of Nicola Sturgeon's SNP government. Anna Sarwar was only elected leader of the Scottish Labour Party a couple of months ago. He joins me now from Glasgow. Mr Sarwar, welcome, a fresh face on the programme. Do the Scottish people have the right to determine their own future?
Look, absolutely it's for the Scottish people to choose their own future, and that's why this election is so important. What I'm seeing, is, which is differentiating from what both the SNP and the Tories are saying, is that I'm recognising that this is a pandemic election. I'm recognising these aren't normal times, and they want to go back to the old arguments. They want to go back to the old divisions. They want to have the settling of scores, if you look at the SNP psychodrama. Instead, what I'm saying is, COVID didn't choose between yes, no, leave and remain. The aftermath is not going to choose between yes, no, leave and remain. And what I'm not willing to do is only have a manifesto or a route map to better times that speaks to the half of the population that agrees with me on the Constitution. So we're putting forward a plan for all of Scotland so we can come through this crisis and build that stronger and fairer nation together.
But you've said there shouldn't be a referendum for 5 years. I don't really understand the arbitrary nature of that. Is it just time for the Labour Party to recover or what? Because this is a fundamental question.
We're voting for a parliament, Andrew. So as people will know, we're voting for a parliament.
Yes,
so
of course.
So what people are voting for is what they want the priorities to be for the next 5 years of our parliament. And the case I'm making is, let's focus on the next 5 years on coming through this most difficult year of our collective lifetime, this collective trauma of COVID, and not go back. Let's instead go forward and let's focus on the economic recovery, focus on getting our kids back to school and their mental health, focus on all the cancer catch-up we need and the mental health catch-up that we need, focus on making sure people have a work and jobs to go back to after this crisis. 360,000 Scottish citizens on furlough, worried about if and when they'll have a job to go back to. So you just talked about COP26 in November. Let's take all these opportunities and focus for a change on what unites us rather than what divides us.
So you say the SNP have been going on about the importance of an independence referendum. If they win this election, if they get a majority of seats in the Scottish Parliament, do you accept they then have a moral right to that referendum?
Well, you won't be surprised by my answer, Andrew. I'm a participant, I'm not a spectator. I'm a participant in this election campaign. I'm not going to commentate on the result. I've got 11 days to try and persuade people across Scotland that we can choose something different. We can choose to not have the next 5 years being about an Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson fight. It doesn't have to be about the Constitution. It can be about you, your family and our national recovery. And there's really a fundamental fault line, actually, Andrew, that I think needs to be exposed in this election campaign as well. And that is actually both the SNP and the Tories play up on each other's division. Because we have had 14 years of an SNP government. Nicola Sturgeon has been First Minister for 7 years, and there have been failure after failure. But every time there's a failure, what they do is say, it wouldn't have happened if we had independence, or worse yet, they point at the Tories and say, at least we're not as bad as that lot. Frankly, I think Scotland deserves better than that. We need a better government and we need a better opposition.
I can feel a speech coming on. Can I just ask,
I apologise.
Your equivalent in Wales, Mark Drayford, has said absolutely, if the Welsh vote Plaid Cymru into a majority, then the Welsh people have the right to their referendum. Why is it right for the Welsh but not for the Scots?
No, it's not that. So what I'm saying is I'm not commentating. I hope we have a Welsh Labour government. I hope Mark Drakeford wins the election in Wales. I hope he becomes the First Minister in Wales and carries on all the transformative work he has been doing to help transform Wales and make it a better and fairer nation. I want the same to happen in Scotland. I want in Scotland for us not to focus on division but instead focus on unity.
Keir Starmer has said that an independence referendum is a question for Scotland and the people of Scotland. And you've got at least 3 candidates standing this election who have said more or less the same thing. Yes, of course, there should be a referendum. Across Scotland, when Scottish voters are looking at this election and they're wondering what is the best unionist vote that I can cast, a lot of them, even if they've been lifelong Labour supporters, are going to the Tories because they seem safer, more secure, more solid unionists than Labour. What do you say to them?
Well, what I say to that is, what you just proved there, Andrew, is not just politicians and political parties, but actually the wider political bubble is obsessed about the referendum, obsessed about the Constitution, and forget we're in a pandemic. Every question's been about the referendum. What people care about in Scotland right now isn't the date of a referendum. What they care about is keeping their loved ones safe. When they're going to get a vaccine. if and when they got a job to go back to, their children's education. These are the big issues that this election campaign should be all about. But the political bubble keeps wanting to talk about independence. Why? Have they not noticed the crisis that's facing our country? And if now, in the midst of a pandemic, we can't pull ourselves together as a country and our parliament can't pull itself together, then when? We deserve a better politics than this. We deserve a better parliament than this, and that's the case I'm making in this election campaign.
Surely the Scottish people are bright enough to understand all of that and all the different priorities, but also bright enough and ready enough to have a say for their own future.
They are. The challenge is, I wish our politicians were as bright as the population. So our politicians need to put forward a better case in this election campaign rather than wanting to go back to the old divisions.
And a Sarwar, a world in which the politicians were as bright as the public. That's what we can all look forward to.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much.
Fingers crossed one day.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Cheers.
Now then, David Hockney has always believed the great painters do their best work in old age. At 83, he has his opportunity to demonstrate it. Big new exhibitions are coming of his latest work, done in Normandy, and describing the arrival of spring. Love life is his personal motto, and when I spoke to Hockney recently, he began by telling me why he chose Normandy.
I came to Normandy in 2018. I came to see the biotapestry, but when we were driving about, I suggested there'd be lots more blossom here in Normandy, and there is. Apart from hawthorn blossom, there's apple blossom, pear blossom, plum blossom, cherry blossom, apricot blossom. So I thought it would be very good to do the arrival of spring here. So we got this house and came in early 2019 to do it. And it was over before I'd really begun. So I thought, well, we'll do it in 2020. And I finished up doing 220 paintings of it on the iPad. I chose 220 to go with 2020, of course, because they fit together.
And you've got big new shows planned in Paris and in London. Just tell us a little bit about them.
I'm having a show in London of 116 of the arrival of spring. But then in October, we're showing at the Orangery in Paris the whole year in Normandy that is made up in one big picture, long picture, like the biotapestry, which is going to be 88 meters long.
Now, you've been inspired by that ancient work, the Bayeux Tapestry. Why is that so thrilling to you?
Here's the biotapestry, you see. It's done like this, and this is the whole of the biotapestry in a book. We're doing the book like this. I've made it into one picture. There it is.
At 83, you seem to be working harder than ever. You seem to be more productive than ever. How come?
Yes, I'm working away now because I'm 83. How much longer do I have? I don't know. I'm still a smoker. But working is very good for me. It gives me a new lease of life. I've got a new lease of life here, and I'm just going to go on working here. I've always something to do. We live in a little Seven Dwarfs house in the middle of a 4-acre field, and I think it's a great place, a wonderful place for me now. I'm pretty deaf. I don't really like listening that much anymore. I prefer just working, so it's fine for me here, absolutely fine.
You're spending a lot of your time now, of course, very close to where you're living in France, just observing and recording the passing of nature. What's your advice to all those people who are simply fed up to the back teeth with the pandemic and desperate to get on a plane and go somewhere else?
If you're bored because of the lockdown, and you're trapped in some small place, then if you look at the world and really look at it, it's very beautiful. It's a mad world, really, I think, but it's very beautiful to look at, I think. Nature is always beautiful, it's always harmonious. But you've really got to look at it. You've got to look at it to see colour. You've really got to look at it intensely. And I would suggest that's what you do. Just sit down and look at it, or walk and look at it. And it's very beautiful, really. Yes, I think so.
The great David Hockney there, and that exhibition of his new work opens at the Royal Academy of Art in London on the 23rd of May. In the meantime, you can get an insight into Hockney's creative process in a new book written with Martin Gayford, Spring Cannot Be Cancelled. Now, my final guest this morning is the leader of the SNP and the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon, welcome. You have said recently nobody in the SNP wants to see a border between England and Scotland, but you're also committed, if you achieve independence, to joining the EU and the single market, which does mean a border. You can't have both. So which is it?
Well, I want us to be part of the world's biggest single market. It's 7 times the size of the UK market. But of course, I want to and will work with others to make sure we keep trade flowing easily across the border between Scotland and England. Remember, of course, nobody with any credibility suggests that an independent Scotland wouldn't continue to be a member of the common travel area, so free movement of people across the UK, and if we were in the EU, across the EU would be guaranteed. But the point I'm making is that it's not the SNP that raises issues of borders. This issue only transpires because of the UK government's Brexit obsession and the fact that they have ripped Scotland out of the EU against our will. And the question for Scotland, of course, we want to keep trade flowing across the England-Scotland border, and that would be in the interest of England as well, and we would work to make sure that happens. But do we also want to return to a position where we have free trade across the European single market? The absence of that right now is causing real economic and financial harm to our exporting companies.
I'm just suggesting that whatever the history, you can't have both. 60% of Scotland's exports go to the rest of the UK, and more or less the same coming back. So that border staying open is really important. But inside the EU, they will expect you to police that border.
And we will work to make sure that we have trade flowing easily across that border. Just in point of fact, Andrew, as I'm sure you are aware, Scotland exports more manufactured goods to the rest of the world than we do to the rest of the UK. So the importance of being able to trade freely, not just across the UK, which is important, and I have never tried to suggest otherwise, and we will need to work to make sure that can be secured. But the importance of being able to trade across the European single market area and indeed internationally is also really, really vital. And the invidious position that Scotland had, let me finish the point. The invidious position that Scotland has been forced into of losing access to the single market is not some abstract hypothetical. It is costing our exporting businesses, particularly in our world-class food and drink sector, a lot of money and a lot of lost economic opportunity right now. We shouldn't be forced to choose between these two things. That is something that has happened to us against our democratic will, and it is a very real price that Scotland is paying right now for not being an independent country.
Well, you pick me up quite rightly on point of fact. You say, well, let's stick to point of fact. I've got the EU regulations here governing the physical checks on consignments of animals and goods entering the Union. You would be part of this Union under your proposals, and that sets out which goods need to be physically inspected as they enter the single market. 30% of poultry, eggs, milk and fish, 100% of live animals. Can you explain to people watching how, as a member of the EU, you would police that border as would be your duty?
I'm not denying what the EU regulations say. I am not denying that because of the absurdity of Brexit and the Tory Brexit obsession, then all sorts of issues are raised for Scotland completely against our democratic will. What I'm saying is we would work as a country to make sure that for our businesses there was no difficulties in terms of their day-to-day experience in trading. But the other point I am making, which is a really important point, is that right now we have been are being denied access on that free trade basis to a market that is 7 times bigger than the UK market. And I want Scotland to be able to trade freely across that. And yes, to do the work that takes away the practical difficulties for trade across the England-Scotland border. Nobody is trying. So we're not, if you're trying to have a debate with me here about what the EU regulations say, it's a pretty one-sided one, because I'm not denying it.
I'm not. I'm just saying the EU regulations absolutely commit you to a physical border posts along the Scottish-English border. Now, you may wish Brexit didn't happen, but it has happened. And where we are now, entering the EU and being part of the single market requires a physical border with England for an independent Scotland. Now, the only ways out of that are you can persuade the EU to give up on the single market regulations as they apply to Scotland, and good luck with that, or you can persuade the English to give up on Brexit, and good luck with that. I don't see your way through here.
We will put in place arrangements, and we will negotiate those arrangements with the UK that means that businesses do not, in a practical sense, suffer from any of that. And of course, before we get to a point where we're asking people to choose whether or not they want Scotland to become independent, which is the choice of the Scottish people, just as we did in 2014, we will set out all of the implications of independence, all of the advantages of independence, and all of the practical issues that people have to consider, so that people make an informed choice. But the difference between that and what we are suffering right now in Scotland is that Brexit has happened to us. And as I say, it's not abstract. Our companies right now are having to deal with border issues that have been imposed on us completely against our will. The difference with independence is we look at all of the implications and we make a choice over what in the overall consideration is best for Scotland's interests. Right now, this is all happening to us because we don't have that choice.
I understand that, and I'm going to come to Brexit in a moment. But before we do, let's stick to the detail again. If Scotland rejoins the EU, businesses exporting to the UK would have to fill in customs declarations, which cost between £15 and £56 a piece. And some would need to fill in export health certificates, which cost up to £175 each. Are you telling Scottish exporters to the rest of the UK that is a price worth paying for independence?
We'll set out when we come to an independence referendum what the implications are and whether we would be proposing measures to mitigate any of that for businesses. These are choices people will get to make on the basis of full information. But of course, Scotland voted against Brexit. And right now, our export businesses, you're projecting into the future, which is absolutely legitimate because I'm proposing independence. But right now, our businesses are facing these barriers. They're facing these costs. They're facing all these inconveniences. And it's completely against the will of the people of Scotland. So if Scotland in future chooses independence, it will choose independence with full availability of all of the information so that people can take a considered view and reach an informed choice. And that is how democracy should work in any country. But of course, that's not Scotland's experience right now.
Your proposal in this election is it's a stepping stone to the referendum, which is a stepping stone to independence. So it is part of the same argument. This is part of the independence argument throughout this election. And the only point I'm putting to you is that the course that you have chosen does necessarily and more or less inevitably mean a hard border with England.
Andrew,
you can say there'll be arrangements for discussions, but
you've just said there the course You've just said there the course I have chosen.
Which is Scottish independence and EU membership.
If Scotland becomes independent and, you know, the scenarios that you're trying to paint for me here transpire, that will be because not I have chosen that. That will be because a majority of the Scottish people have looked at all of the arguments, have looked at all of the information, have looked at all of the detail and have made that choice for the future of Scotland.
I'm just putting to you the facts of EU membership. Facts are shields that will not ding, as somebody said. I mean, and they are the facts there. They're what you will face after independence.
And have I denied any of the facts of the rules of EU membership?
No, you haven't. But you haven't explained how you can maintain an open border in those circumstances at all.
We will put.
You said there'll be negotiations, but how?
And that we will keep trade flowing freely. We will comply with all of the requirements of EU membership, but we will put in place arrangements to keep trade flowing. And of course, for people, right now, people in Scotland have lost their freedom of movement across the European Union. Independence with Scotland as part of the common travel area. Not only do we keep our ability to travel freely across the common travel area, we get the ability again to travel freely across the European Union. Right
so
now,
Scotland will be
our
the
rights
only...
have been
Sorry,
diminished
I'm not
against
I'm not
our
arguing with you
democratic
about
will.
that.
And
I'm
in
just saying
future, in future, if Scotland chooses to be independent and chooses to come to a conclusion that on balance, all of these things are in our best interest, that will be a democratic choice that Scotland makes on the basis of all of the information that is put before them.
Of course it will be. I'm only putting it to you that under your proposal, Scotland would be the only part of the EU which had an open border for goods and animals and food processing and so forth with a non-EU member. It would be the only part of the EU that had that advantage. And I think it's highly unlikely, that's all. Can I ask you, has the SNP modelled the impact of independence on people's incomes?
Not yet. We will do all of that as we did in 2014 as we get to an independence referendum. And we will do that then. Why? Because that will take account of all of the up-to-date financial and economic information. I mean, if we had done that, for example, just over a year ago, before the COVID pandemic struck, then obviously that modelling would be out of date now because the world has been turned upside down. So we put the information before people when we get to the point of asking people to make a choice. And of course, none of that was put before people in the Brexit referendum. Whether people agree with it or not, you can go and look at the 2014 white paper where all of the information was put before people and people were asked to make a choice. And we will do that again when we get to the point of asking people to choose independence.
Don't you think it's shameful that a government looking to take Scotland out of the UK hasn't even bothered to look at the impact on the economy?
If I was asking people a week on Thursday to vote on the question of whether or not Scotland should be independent, then yes, I would agree with that. But I'm not asking people to make that choice on Thursday. And if I was to do all of that modelling now, we'd have to redo it when we got to the point of asking people to make that choice, because I believe it is right to only ask people to make a choice of that magnitude and of that importance on the basis of quality, up-to-date information. That's what we did in 2014, and it is what we will do again. We're in an election to the Scottish... Well, hold on. We're in an election to the Scottish Parliament where I am asking people to vote for me as First Minister to continue to lead us through a global pandemic, then to implement a manifesto, a bold, transformative manifesto to get our recovery kick-started and to drive that recovery forward. And then, yes, when we're out of the crisis, to give people in Scotland the choice over what kind of future we want and what kind of country we want to build. And I will put before the people of Scotland the information they need to make that informed choice when we're asking them to make that. That's the right and proper way to proceed.
It's just that you said back in 2018, you said, I really do think it is shameful that the UK government is the government that's looking to take the UK out of the European Union and hasn't even bothered to properly look at the impact on our economy.
Yes,
and you're
Andrew.
in the same position.
No, I'm not in the same position. I mean, with the greatest of respect, Andrew, when I said that, they had a referendum without putting that position forward. They were in a negotiation with the EU, imposing or in the process of imposing a hard Brexit without having done that. We were in the reality, not just of people having been asked to make a decision, but that decision being implemented. I am talking about a referendum in the future where people get the choice, that when we ask people to make that choice, you're absolutely right. It would be shameful for somebody in my position not to put that information before them. But you're asking me to put the cart rather before the horse, and you're comparing apples and pears, frankly, in terms of the two positions you're putting before me right now.
I have a cart and some pears or something here because the LSE...
Well, good. Well, perhaps we could go on to them in
the
right
go
order. We've got a Scottish Parliament election in just 10 days' time.
We do.
We could perhaps maybe talk about it.
OK. The LSE Centre for Economic Performance have done some modelling, and they say that leaving the UK and rejoining the EU could drive down Scottish incomes by between 6.3% and nearly 8%, 7.6%. Is that the price people should be willing to pay for independence?
I think if that's the study, I think you're quoting at me, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong here. I think by its own admission, it was a very narrowly based study that didn't properly take account of the advantages.
You say narrowly based, Nicola Sturgeon. You say narrowly based, but it's exactly the same study which produced the same model that you were quoting after Brexit. And then you said this analysis demonstrates that leaving the EU will have a profound and long-lasting impact on the public finances and the wider economic and societal well-being of Scotland. It's the same economist, the same model, the same analysis.
Fine. Well, you know what you're quoting. I don't know for sure what you're quoting because I don't have it in front of me, but I will take your word. I will take your word for that, and I'll engage on the substance of the point. You see, the point you're putting to me, Andrew, is leading or asking people to lead to a conclusion that says that somehow uniquely, you were talking about unique situations earlier on, that somehow uniquely Scotland is incapable of being a successful, prosperous, independent country, notwithstanding the fact that we look across Europe right now, we look across the world, and we see a plethora, a multitude of countries similar in size to Scotland, sometimes smaller than Scotland, lacking all of the resources that Scotland has. And, you know, by and large, almost without exception, these countries are wealthier than Scotland. They are healthier than Scotland. They are happier in terms of the studies that are done. Scotland is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And if you're pointing me to studies that are about Scotland's fiscal position within the United Kingdom, then frankly, that's not an argument against independence. That is an argument for Scotland being able to take control of our vast resources, make better economic decisions than Westminster governments tend to make on our behalf, and build the same prosperity that countries similar to us enjoy already. So frankly, these are arguments for Scotland becoming independent, not against.
To be absolutely clear, of course I am not suggesting that an independent Scotland could not be prosperous. I am suggesting that there are choices and hard choices to be made.
Of course.
According to the IFS, your deficit is going to head towards 24 to 25% of GDP, much, much higher than the rest of the UK and vastly worse than the 3% that the EU require for candidate states. So there is an enormous gap there to be filled. And yet in this election, you're spending money in all directions.
For me here. You're making my point for me here. That deficit that you talk about, and you're quoting, I think, an IFS study that's not actually published yet, if it's the one I've read about in a newspaper this morning. But you're quoting a study that is about Scotland's fiscal position within the United Kingdom. It's not a reflection of what Scotland would be like as an independent country. And I'm sure it hasn't escaped your notice that the deficits and debt of all countries over the past year has increased as countries quite rightly have borrowed to support COVID policies. The UK debt has gone over £2 trillion. Now, right now, the taxes that are paid in Scotland pay for health and education, all of those devolved services, as well as reserve services like welfare and pensions. So we raise the money to pay for all of these important things. And like every other country, we would have a deficit if we were an independent country tomorrow. But there's no credible economists in any other country suggesting that countries should manage those deficits through austerity and cuts. Again, why would Scotland be unique? And you talk about tough choices. Scotland needs no lectures about tough choices. We have suffered a decade of Tory austerity. Again, a bit like Brexit, completely against our will, where other countries chose to deal with the financial crash differently. This is about choices, but it's about choices that we make as a country and are able to take ourselves, not choices that are imposed upon us, which is Scotland's experience all too often right now.
But whatever its origins, you are facing a really big deficit, which has to be closed somehow. In this campaign, you're offering lots of new public services and lots of new public money. My question to you is very, very simple. How are you going to close the deficit?
Well, if you're asking me about our manifesto for this election, I'm assuming you're familiar with the Scottish Government's medium-term financial strategy, which was published in January, which takes account of the projections from the Scottish Fiscal Commission, the OBR, in terms of the growth in our tax revenues over the lifetime of the next Parliament, also takes account of the best assumptions we can make, because we are still within the UK of what the Barnett formula will deliver in terms of resources to Scotland, and we make a cautious assumption about what that allows us to deliver. And we're choosing to invest in things like 100,000 new affordable homes, for example, which will also help to kickstart economic activity and be a boost for our economy.
Okay.
Longer term, if you're projecting forward to when Scotland is independent and you're asking me how we deal with a deficit, we'll deal with a deficit in the same way almost every other country across the world that has a deficit deals with that. You manage your finances through borrowing, through prudent decisions about public spending. Again, Scotland would not be unique as a country with a deficit.
We have run out of time, I'm afraid.
It would almost be unique if it didn't have a deficit, and we deal with that in the way that independent countries the world over.
This is a conversation that could go on for hours, I suspect, but we have run out of time. Nicola Sturgeon, thanks very much indeed for joining us. We'll have those hours later on. Thanks for all my guests today, and of course to you for watching. But until next Sunday, goodbye.